All right, let's dive into some fascinating stuff today. We're taking a deep dive into excerpts from Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. You've given us some really thought-provoking passages, so I'm ready to get into these big ideas, like the Superman, eternal recurrence, and a whole lot more.
Nietzsche's definitely one of those thinkers who, well, he keeps you on your toes.
He really does. And to even start to unpack any of this, I think we need to talk about the book's format for a second. It's not your typical philosophical essay, is it?
Not at all.
It's written more like a myth with this prophet-like figure, Zarathustra, coming down from the mountains to share these radical ideas with humanity.
Exactly. And Nietzsche chose this format very intentionally. He wasn't just aiming for, like intellectual arguments. He wanted his ideas to resonate on a deeper level.
Almost like a story that stays with you long after you finish reading.
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of resonating deeply, I was reading that Nietzsche himself had this incredibly intense experience writing Zarathustra.
No, absolutely.
Almost like he was possessed. He described ideas hitting him like lightning strikes.
Yeah.
And he would just furiously scribble them down.
It's fascinating because, Nietzsche saw himself as like a conduit
Hmm.
for this really powerful creative force. It wasn't just him crafting these arguments. It was almost like he was channeling something much bigger.
Wow. Yeah. That's a great way to set the stage. So with Nietzsche as this like lightning struck philosopher poet, let's get into some of the excerpts you've chosen. I think a good place to start might be this concept of the Superman. One passage that you flagged that really stood out to me was this line: "Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Superman, a rope over an abyss." What do you make of that?
It is such a powerful image, isn't it? Nietzsche is basically saying that humanity, well, it's not the end point. We're this bridge, this in-between state capable of, well, great and terrible things. But the goal, the meaning of the earth, as Zarathustra puts it, is to evolve into something greater. The Superman.
I think a lot of people, when they hear Superman, and I know I did at first, we picture like a comic book hero. But I'm sensing that Nietzsche was aiming for something a lot deeper, right?
Right, yeah, absolutely. The Superman isn't about physical strength or superpowers. It's a philosophical ideal, representing humanity's potential to transcend our limitations.
Our own limitations, but also the limitations imposed by traditional morality.
Yeah, exactly. It's about embracing this idea of the will to power and forging new values based on what Nietzsche called life affirmation.
That makes me think of the three metamorphoses of the spirit that Zarathustra describes: the camel, the lion, and the child. Could those be stages in this journey of becoming the Superman?
I think so, yeah, absolutely. The camel that represents the spirit burdened by tradition, weighed down by all of society's expectations. And then the lion is the spirit that rebels, the one who says no to those imposed values and fights for freedom. And then finally we have the child, who represents the spirit that is then free to create, to play, to invent new values, almost like a spirit of pure unburdened potential.
So is that what Nietzsche means by embracing the will to power? Is it about shedding those burdens and becoming this free, creative force? I have to admit, some of the passages that you shared make it sound like he's almost glorifying power, and I can see how that could be misinterpreted.
Oh, it definitely is. It's a concept that is often misunderstood. When Nietzsche talks about will to power, he's not talking about dominating others. It's more about self-mastery, about striving to reach your full potential, about overcoming obstacles.
Internal and external.
Yes, exactly. It's the force behind growth and creation.
So to put it maybe a little too simply, it's less about being like a dictator and more about being the best, most powerful version of yourself.
I think that captures the essence of it. It's about pushing your own boundaries, not about trampling over others. Think of like an artist creating a masterpiece, or a scientist making a groundbreaking discovery, an entrepreneur building a company. It's that same vital force, that drive to create and to overcome.
Okay, so we've got this idea of the Superman as this ideal of self-overcoming, and this will to power as the driving force behind it. Now, I want to get into another concept that really caught my eye: eternal recurrence. You marked a passage where Zarathustra encounters a demon who presents him with this idea. I'd love to hear your take on this.
This is where things get really interesting. So imagine living your life over and over again, exactly the same way for all eternity. Every joy, every sorrow, every decision, just replayed infinitely. Would you embrace it or would you despair? That's the question at the heart of eternal recurrence.
Wow, yeah, that's a lot to wrap your head around. So is Nietzsche saying we should live each moment as if it were going to happen an infinite number of times?
Precisely. He's using this as a thought experiment to challenge us, Like, would we live differently if every choice we made had this kind of eternal weight? Eternal recurrence is a call to live authentically, to make choices that we can stand behind, not just in this life, but for all eternity.
So it's not just about living in the moment, it's about living in the eternal moment. It really makes you think twice about all those everyday decisions, doesn't it?
It does.
But before we get too lost in that mind-bending concept, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality. There are some pretty strong statements in these excerpts where Zarathustra just rails against priests and conventional ideas of good and evil.
Yes, and this is where Nietzsche's ideas can be, well, very challenging, even radical. He saw traditional morality, especially Christian morality, as life-denying. He felt that it was rooted in weakness and resentment, that it glorified self-denial, and held back the potential for human greatness.
There's a line you highlighted where Zarathustra says, "I am a law only for mine own. I am not a law for all." It seems like he's rejecting this whole idea of a universal moral code.
He is, absolutely. He believed that humanity was capable of creating new values based on, well, strength, individual flourishing, and the will to power. He wanted to liberate people from the shackles of what he considered a slave morality that glorified weakness and obedience.
I'm starting to see how all these ideas connect. The Superman, the will to power, this rejection of traditional morality. And it leads us to, well, what's probably Nietzsche's most provocative idea, the death of God.
Yes, the death of God.
You flagged that very famous quote where Zarathustra proclaims, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." Now, it's important to understand, I think, that Nietzsche wasn't being literal here. He wasn't saying that, a supreme being had literally died. What he meant was that the traditional concept of God, particularly the Christian God, had lost its power and influence in modern society.
That's right.
So it's more like God had become irrelevant, a fading idea.
Exactly, and Nietzsche saw this death of God as both liberating and terrifying. It freed humanity from, all this religious dogma, but it also created this void, this sense of meaninglessness that needed to be filled with new values. And for Nietzsche, the answer to that void was the Superman, the being who could create those new values and embrace the fullness of life without relying on the crutch of a god.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. And I feel like I need a moment to just let it all sink in.
Me too.
Listeners, we're going to take a short break, but stick with us. Because in part 2, we're going to be exploring some of the more subtle and often overlooked nuances of Nietzsche's thinking. We'll delve into his ideas on friendship, pity, and what he calls the last man. And we'll even try to unpack what all of this means for us today.
Welcome back. So I'm curious to hear what you're thinking as we delve deeper into Nietzsche. What's resonating with you so far?
Yeah, it's a lot to process, that's for sure. Still kind of grappling with this whole idea of the Superman and the will to power. But I think what's really striking me are some of these more subtle things that Nietzsche observes about human nature. He's like this psychological X-ray, just seeing right through all of our motivations and desires.
He really is, yeah. And, one thing that stood out to me, and it might seem a little provocative, but it's his critique of pity.
Pity?
Yeah, he calls it a heavy cloud.
Yeah.
Hanging over humanity.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, we usually think of compassion as a good thing, right? So how is pity a problem for Nietzsche?
Well, he's not saying that we shouldn't care about others. It's more that he's critiquing a certain kind of pity that he saw as rooted in weakness, a pity that focuses on suffering without offering real solutions.
So instead of helping someone overcome their suffering,
yeah,
it keeps them stuck in it.
Exactly. He felt that it kept people stuck in their misery rather than empowering them to overcome it.
I see. So maybe that ties back to this idea of the will to power, right? This drive to overcome challenges.
Absolutely. He believed that true compassion should be about inspiring growth and self-overcoming, not just dwelling on pain and weakness.
So helping people tap into their own strength and resilience.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and that makes me think about a passage you flagged about friendship, where Nietzsche says, "In one's friend one shall have one's best enemy. Thou shalt be closest unto him with thy heart when thou withstandest him."
That's a really different way of looking at friendship. It is, isn't it? He challenges this idea that friendship is about always agreeing and supporting each other blindly.
Right, yeah.
He's suggesting that real friendship should push you to grow, to question your assumptions, even to disagree.
So it's less about blind support and more about honesty and pushing each other to become better versions of ourselves.
Yes, and I find that idea incredibly powerful. True friends, they shouldn't coddle each other's weaknesses. They should challenge each other,
Yeah.
even if it means having difficult conversations.
That definitely gives me something to think about in my own friendships. But speaking of challenging conventions, we can't talk about Nietzsche without addressing his critiques of, well, of religion, particularly Christianity. Some of the passages that you selected are pretty scathing.
They are, and this is where things can get
Mm.
understandably controversial. Nietzsche was writing at a time when Christianity was such a dominant force in society, and he saw its emphasis on humility, self-denial,
Mm.
and the afterlife as fundamentally life-denying.
There's that line where Zarathustra says, "They call God that which opposed and afflicted them. And verily, there was much hero spirit in their worship. And they knew not how to love their God, otherwise than by nailing men to the cross."
Mm.
I mean, that's some pretty intense imagery. So was he just trying to be shocking? Or was there a deeper point he was making?
I mean, his language can be strong,
Hmm.
but I think it's important to understand his perspective here. He genuinely saw these values as harmful to human flourishing. He believed that Christianity created a culture of guilt and shame, and he felt it was time for humanity to move beyond those constraints and embrace the fullness of earthly existence.
It's interesting because it's like he's not just critiquing religion here. He's also taking aim at this figure he calls the last man, this complacent, risk-averse person who represents the kind of the opposite of the Superman.
You're exactly right.
You highlighted that passage where Zarathustra describes the last man, seeking a little poison now and then, for that maketh pleasant dreams, and much poison at last for a pleasant death. Which is a chilling image.
It really is.
It's like this person who's just settled for a life of mediocrity and comfort, afraid to embrace any real passion or challenge.
And for Nietzsche, that was the ultimate danger, this slow death of the human spirit. He saw the last man
Yeah.
as the embodiment of everything he was fighting against, this complacency, conformity, the denial of life's inherent challenges and uncertainties.
So it's not just about overcoming religious dogma, but it's also about overcoming this mindset, this way of being that avoids risk and embraces comfort over growth.
Precisely. Nietzsche's philosophy is a call to action, a challenge to shake ourselves out of that complacency and strive for something greater.
It makes you wonder what Nietzsche would make of our world today with all of our technological advancements and comforts and everything. Do you think we're moving closer to the Superman? Or closer to the last man?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think he would be both horrified and fascinated by our modern world. He'd likely see the potential for both incredible progress and profound stagnation.
Yeah, I can see that. This whole discussion has made me think of a concept that's not explicitly mentioned in the passages you shared, but it feels so relevant to me. Amor fati. Have you ever thought about that in relation to Thus Spake Zarathustra?
Oh, that's such a brilliant connection.
Yeah.
You're right. It's not directly addressed in the book, but amor fati is absolutely central to Nietzsche's philosophy, and it ties so beautifully into everything we've been discussing.
For those who might not be familiar, could you explain amor fati?
Yeah, it's often translated as love of fate, but I think a more nuanced understanding is love of one's fate.
Yeah.
It's not just accepting what life throws at you,
Yeah.
but embracing it fully. Loving every joy, every sorrow,
Yeah.
every triumph, every failure as essential parts of your unique journey.
So not passive resignation, but an active affirmation of everything you experience.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that both the light and the shadow, the joy and the sorrow, they're all essential to who you are. And even the most difficult experiences can offer opportunities for growth, for learning, for deepening your understanding of yourself and the world.
That actually reminds me of a passage from Zarathustra that we haven't touched on yet, the one about the bestowing virtue. Zarathustra says, "Verily a new good and evil is it. Verily a new deep murmuring and the voice of a new fountain. Power is it, this new virtue, a ruling thought is it, and around it a subtle soul, a golden sun with the serpent of knowledge around it." What do you make of that?
That passage is, it's so rich with imagery. And I think it offers a key to understanding this path towards amor fati. The bestowing virtue seems to be about moving beyond those rigid ideas of good and evil, of reward and punishment.
Yeah.
It's about a more expansive, creative way of being in the world.
So instead of focusing on what you're getting or losing, it's more about giving freely. Giving
Yes.
your energy, your creativity, without expecting anything in return.
Exactly. Aligning yourself with the flow of life,
Yeah.
with constant change and becoming, finding fulfillment in the act of creation itself.
That makes me think of self-overcoming, another one of Nietzsche's ideas. Maybe the bestowing virtue is how we overcome our own limitations, our fears, our ego, to tap into that creative force
Yeah.
that Nietzsche saw as the heart of the Superman.
I love that connection. It really does bring this whole exploration full circle. Nietzsche, for all of his complexity and sometimes seemingly contradictions, is ultimately about embracing the fullness of life. It's about pushing past our limits, facing our fears, and creating ourselves anew in each moment.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Thus Spake Zarathustra, I think the question we want to leave you with is this: what does amor fati mean for you? How can you embrace the totality of your experience, the joys and the sorrows, and find meaning in the very act of living and becoming?
It's a powerful question.
Yeah.
And a worthy challenge. And as Nietzsche himself might say, become who you are.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time as we continue to explore the world of ideas.
So we're back, and I gotta say, that idea of amor fati, it's really stuck with me.
Yeah.
It's beautiful and inspiring, but I keep bumping up against this question: how do you actually do that? How do you learn to love every aspect of your fate, even the painful parts?
That's the question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. And I don't think there's an easy answer or a one-size-fits-all formula for achieving amor fati. It's more like a lifelong process, a journey of self-discovery and acceptance.
So maybe it's less about reaching this perfect state of bliss
Yeah.
where nothing bothers you, and more about just continually working towards embracing the whole picture, the good and the bad.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. It's about understanding that the light and the shadow, the joy and the sorrow, they're all part of what makes you you. And even the toughest experiences they can be, opportunities for growth, for learning, for deeper understanding. It reminds me of another passage from Zarathustra, actually, that we haven't really touched on yet. The one about the bestowing virtue. Zarathustra says, "Verily, a new good and evil is it. Verily, a new deep murmuring and the voice of a new fountain. Power is it, this new virtue, a ruling thought is it, and around it a subtle soul, a golden sun with the serpent of knowledge around it." What do you make of that?
Oh, that passage, it's so rich with imagery. And I think it offers a key to understanding this path towards amor fati. The bestowing virtue seems to be about moving beyond those rigid ideas of good and evil, of reward and punishment. It's about a more expansive and creative way of being in the world.
So instead of focusing on what you're getting or losing, it's more about giving freely, giving your energy, your creativity, without expecting anything in return.
Exactly. Aligning yourself with the flow of life, with constant change and becoming, finding fulfillment in the act of creation itself.
That makes me think of self-overcoming, another one of Nietzsche's ideas. Maybe the bestowing virtue is how we overcome our own limitations, our fears, our ego, to tap into that creative force that Nietzsche saw as the heart of the Superman.
I love that connection. It really does bring this whole exploration full circle. Nietzsche, for all of his complexity and sometimes seemingly contradictions, is ultimately about embracing the fullness of life. It's about pushing past our limits, our fears, and creating ourselves anew in each moment.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Thus Spake Zarathustra, I think the question we want to leave you with is this: what does amor fati mean for you? How can you embrace the totality of your experience, the joys and the sorrows, and find meaning in the very act of living and becoming?
That's a powerful question and a worthy challenge, as Nietzsche himself might say, become who you are.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Nietzsche. We'll see you next time. As we continue to explore the world of ideas,